what I and my companions are upon today. The Prophet ﷺ did not say the Jews split up into 71 groups and the Christians split up into 73 groups and the Muslims will split up into 73 groups, and this is the mercy of Allah. And this is the bounties of Allah upon you, that you differ and you all have your own religions. And you stay separated and each one to your own self, being happy with what you have. Rather, he said, وَلَا تَكُونُوا مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ. And don't be like the mushrikeen, those who split up their deen into groups. كُلُّ حِزْبٍ بِمَا لَدَيْهِمْ فَرِحُونَ. Every group from amongst them being happy and rejoicing with what they have. Naam ya Ahmed.
Can you clarify more on what the difference between the Sahaba themselves, right? When they say that the Prophet said this and the Prophet said that, right? So is this a Rahmah, and how we go about this difference?
Were you here when I talked about the differing of the Sahaba? Yeah, you were here in the beginning.
Yeah, but
so now the point about what some of the scholars said about the Sahaba differing, the Sahaba themselves specifically. The Sahaba differed on issues, and you have the statement of Ibn Umar, and he differed with Ibn Abbas in an issue. And maybe the third position, Aisha held the third position on the same issue. Had it not been for this differing, then there would be no fiqh. There would be nothing called fiqh. There would be nothing called ijtihad. There would be nothing called any ulama, scholars. There would be no need for scholars. There would be no need for knowledge. Just have one book. That's all. This is your Islam. From start to finish, the scholars all agreed on this. The scholars agreed on this. Point 2. Point 3, the scholars agreed on this. Point 4, the scholars agreed on this. The deen from beginning to end, every bab in the deen is ijma'. If that was the case, then, as I mentioned, much of the deen and much of the reward for the ulama and the bounty of knowledge and applying it and looking into the knowledge, looking into the evidences and making reasoned decisions, and the virtue of some people over others because of their strength and knowledge, all of those things would be lost. And all we would have is this or that. You're with the ijma', you're with this one book that has all the answers in it, the answer key. You're with it, or you're in the hellfire. End of story. But from the mercy of Allah Azza wa Jal, the actual correct position that He wanted from His servant, that you did not reach, that you intended to reach, and you tried, and you sought guidance from the Book of Allah and from the Sunnah of the Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and from the scholars of Islam, and you arrived at a decision that in fact wasn't what Allah wanted from you, you're going to receive reward in the hereafter for that. Because why? You didn't oppose the ijma' of the Muslims. You didn't oppose the consensus of the Muslims. It was an issue where they differed. Because of that differing, it allowed you to try to find the correct position, and in fact even be mistaken and still get reward from Allah Azza wa Jalla. You got the idea? From that angle they said, and it's not a number of scholars really, that's a lot, a small number of scholars said this, trying to find a way to make this statement, al-ikhtilaf rahmah, the differing is a mercy, trying to make it acceptable in some way. So they reached and they looked and they found this way of explaining it to make it sound correct. And it has an angle. And in general, it's not a bad explanation of that, of what could be a possible angle of the correctness of that statement. Some of the journalists in the Muslim lands, they have begun to write articles, and as you know, in the Muslim lands, sometimes people write articles about Islamic topics and they're not qualified. They're just journalists. And people come on news stations and they talk about Islam, or they talk on behalf of Islam, and they're actually not qualified with Sharia knowledge. They're perhaps broadcasters or people who studied journalism. And they begin to issue religious verdicts, and they begin to enter into Islamic rulings, which they have no place to do that. And one of the virtues of one of our ulama, Shaykh Salih al-Fawzan, is he actively follows this affair. He actively collects the mistakes that journalists spread in newspapers to hundreds of thousands of people and on the news programs. And he collects them and he refutes them point by point. And they're gathered in now 3 or 4 volumes of refutations against the newspapers and the people who speak freely in the newspapers about Islamic topics or topics that they have no knowledge or qualification to speak of. The question is, for the sisters, I'm repeating it, you talked about the prohibition of splitting into groups and sects. And, you talked about the order to become a sect. Specifically, we talked about the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that we are told that we have to become a sect, or we have to be in one of those sects. And isn't the idea then of forming a sect something that we are supposed to do? And if we are supposed to do that, on the correct way, but if we did that, like some people say they are Salafi, and they give themselves a name or a title, and that in a way puts them as kind of a sect. Is that the general idea of the question? Then how do we understand that in light of the lesson that you've been given, the lesson that you have given today? Naam. And it's a good question. I ask Allah to reward you for the question. The Sahaba did not call themselves Salafis, and the Sahaba did not even call themselves Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and the Sahaba did not give themselves a name. The Sahabas did not name themselves as a group, because the Sahaba were known to the Prophet ﷺ, and they were known by all of the people. This is the firqa right here. This is the firqat al-najiyah. These are the Sahaba, those spoken about in the Quran. There's no need to form a group. There is no need for them to be identified by any name. When the firaq came, as the Prophet ﷺ foretold, the different sects and the different deviations began to come up in the time of the companions, in the time of the tabi'een. The Qadariyah came, the Rafidha came, the Khawarij came out, the Mu'tazila, the Jahmiyyah, they began to come out more and more and more. Then the scholars of Islam saw a need to identify themselves and to make tamyiz, to identify themselves with a name, to separate themselves from the Khawarij, to separate themselves from the Jahmiyyah, to separate themselves from the Mu'tazila. So they began to use a word called Ahl Sunnah, and refer to themselves as Ahl Sunnah, the Sunni now. A name that was not known to the Sahaba early, that they are Ahl Sunnah. Some of them said Ahlul Hadith. And later on, when other people began to call themselves Ahl Sunnah as well from the deviant groups, they added to that. And they said, then we are Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. We are Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And that became a term used as a reference to the Firqat al-Najiyah, to the saved sect, the sect that the Prophet ﷺ spoke about in that hadith of the separation of the Ummah into 73 groups. The phrase Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is not found in the Book of Allah, and it's not found from the Sunnah of the Messenger ﷺ. Yet why did it come about? Is it because Imam Ahmad and Ishaq and Ibn Manda and Al-Lalaka'i and the great scholars, Al-Ajurri and those who defended the Aqeedah of Ahl Sunnah, is it because they wanted to make a new party and they wanted to split away from the Muslims? Or was it made to identify this is the haqq, and those other claims, the Khawarij and the Murji'ah and the Mu'tazila and the Jahmiyyah and the Qadariyah, all of those who have now branched off into groups and parties, which is what is prohibited, they are not from us and we are not from them. We are Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And this went on throughout the ages, and the ulama of Islam adapted. As we see here, the ulama had adapted and called themselves Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, again reminding you that there was no precedence for this in the Book of Allah and the Sunnah of the Messenger ﷺ. However, they called themselves Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and that went on. And you find a time now and today, in this day and time, do you not see the Ash'aris calling themselves Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah? Do you not see that? Do you not see the followers of the different Sufi sects calling themselves Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah? Do you not see the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the followers of Sayyid Qutb, different ideologies, even the Khawarij of this day and time, saying we are Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah? If you see that, then is there haraj from saying, let's have a way to identify ourselves so that we are not considered Khawarij? We don't want to say I'm Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah and people understand from that I'm a Khariji, I'm from the Khawarij, because the Khawarij have a big dawah somewhere in some cities. And we don't want the people to understand we're Sufis, or that we're Ash'aris, or on any deviation. So when the phrase Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is